Music is one of the most subjective art forms there is. One person's taste can vary greatly from the next, and we tend to judge music from a deeply visceral place, one unique to each of us. As such, whenever a big music outlet, Rolling Stone, Pitchfork, or otherwise, drops a list of the greatest albums, greatest songs, greatest singers, guitarists, etc., there will always be heated disagreements as no two people's lists will look the same. If nothing else, these lists have become a surefire way to set social media ablaze with discourse about what got picked, what didn't, and in what order. So as Apple Music just wrapped up counting down their list of the 100 greatest albums of all time by revealing 10 albums each day, the online reaction has been testy to say the least. And frankly, so is mine. This list includes many of the finest musical bodies of work to ever exist, don't get me wrong, but I still feel like there was so much deeper they could have dug. And the order of some of the albums on the list range from peculiar to flat out bewildering. So, I've taken it upon myself to re-rank Apple Music's list based on my personal tastes. I'm not going to be adding any new albums here, I'm just going to be moving the existing list's order around. But after seeing the list, my mind was truly blown as to how many great artists past and present wound up missing the cut entirely. I'll quickly go through each of the 100 albums chosen, rearranged in the order I'd have placed them in, while commenting on how much they do or don't deserve to be there, from 100 to 1. These aren't my personal rankings of the greatest albums of all time, just a re-ranking of Apple Music's list specifically. Keep in mind, I'm freestyling most of what I'm about to say from here on out, so apologies if I don't sound super well-spoken. And also remember that I haven't listened to all 100 of these in their entirety, so my ranking will lean in favor of the ones I have. If you disagree with my ranking, let me know in the comments, but as a wise man once said, y'all know this is just my opinion, right? And here we go. Seriously. In what universe other than that of a hardcore Swiftie is the Taylor's version of one of Taylor Swift's old albums, the 18th best album of all time, ahead of Revolver and freaking Pet Sounds? Hate on me in the comments if you will, but I've always found Guns N' Roses music to be a bit overblown, overproduced, misogynistic, and not that exciting artistically, so yeah, nah, not for me. I dislike the Eagles almost as much as I dislike Guns N' Roses. Well, okay, I mostly just hate Don Henley. Now, make no mistake, I have no problem with a Madonna album being on this list, but I feel like the one you should go with would be Ray of Light here, no? Although Rihanna's Anti is definitely the album you go with if you want her on this list, it definitely feels a little bit like Apple Music put her here just so they could make room for certain massively successful pop stars. On that note, however, and a bit of a sidebar, I'm a little surprised they weren't able to also find room for Mariah Carey on this list. I'll be perfectly honest here, I don't know Bad Bunny's music too well. That whole reggaeton world is not something I'm very familiar with personally, but I don't see how this would be remembered as a top 100 album of all time. I also find it a little bit weird that it's the only album that's not recorded in English on this list. Yes, Usher's Confessions was a massively popular album 2 decades ago, but I feel in a way like this was included on the list because it was so massively popular in its time. I don't really feel like it predicted the future of pop music exactly. I can't say I know very much about this George Michael album or his discography as a whole, if I'm being honest. Having said that, he absolutely deserves his flowers as one of the all-time pop greats, and Freedom 90 is a perfect pop song, but I could not name you any other track on this album aside from that one. 50 Cent's Get Rich or Die Tryin' is another album that sold hugely in its day, but I'm not sure it really holds up as one of the great hip-hop albums of the last 25 years. In hindsight, it felt like a new commercial peak for a certain type of rap music, in this case gangsta rap, and also kind of the beginning of the end for that subgenre. Okay, call me a bad Canadian if you will, but I've never really loved Alanis Morissette's music necessarily. However, if you're going to have her on this list, this is 100,000,000,000% the album you go with. This is a good Beyonce album, and its surprise release definitely opened the door for a lot of artists to do the same in the years to come, but I wouldn't have put this on the list knowing she'd make more exciting projects than this one afterward. Hot take incoming, I still think Adele's best album is 19, and that's a hill I have no problem dying on. Now, Nina Simone is an eternal musical legend, but I don't really know her for being an albums artist necessarily, but I'm happy to be proven wrong. If you think I'm sleeping on this album, let me know in the comments. I'll be happy to check it out. I've admittedly never been that much of a Lana Del Rey fan. In fact, she's one of the weakest live acts I have ever seen, but this is definitely her strongest body of work to date. Astroworld is definitely Travis Scott's most ambitious projects and one of his stronger ones, but it's still not 100 best albums of all time material to me. Plus, you could have also made a case for Rodeo being the album on this list instead. Robyn is one of the great pop singers currently living, but I don't really know this album for the album itself. I mostly just know it for certain individual songs. Now, I actually enjoy Arctic Monkeys AM, despite it being their quote-unquote sellout album, but this album is also a polarizing one among their own fans, and personally, I don't think it's even in the same weight class musically as either Whatever People Say I Am, That's What I'm Not, or Favorite Worst Nightmare. I feel like one could have made an argument for Melodrama to be the choice here instead, but as far as Lorde albums go, this is a good one to put on the list if you're gonna have her on here at all. Take Care probably is the closest Drake has come to making a classic, fully cohesive album, but it's still not quite an all-timer to me. I admittedly don't connect with AC/DC's music as much as I did when I was younger, but Back in Black is definitely their most iconic album. By that same token though, it's a bit of a bummer there was no room to also have a Bon Scott album on this list. SZA is one of my favorite artists right now, and SOS is a great project even if it's a little uneven, but I feel strongly that Apple Music should have gone with Control instead. Sade is a living musical legend, and Love Deluxe has several of her biggest songs, No Ordinary Love, Kiss of Life, etc., but I still would have gone with her debut album Diamond Life over this one. Mary J. Blige is another artist whose music I've never necessarily loved always, but I've always respected her and I'm glad she exists, and this is the album you go with if you're gonna have her on the list. Although I haven't heard this album personally, Aretha Franklin is an absolutely titanic figure throughout the history of modern music, and I have heard of this album being named in the conversation as an all-time great album, so I'll definitely give it a shot. This is definitely among Sir Elton's finest works, but I also feel like Apple Music could have just as easily gone with Honky Chateau here instead. As happy as I am to see Tupac on this list, I would have personally gone with Me Against the World, which I think is his masterpiece as far as albums go. Does Lemonade hit it out of the park every time? No, not quite, but it's a generally well-executed concept album, and definitely the most artistically exciting project Beyonce's released to date. That said, it's absolutely not the 10th best album of all time. Zeppelin 2 is a good album, and it contains a lot of Led Zeppelin's most iconic tracks, but for me, their magnum opus is still Zeppelin 4. I'm definitely not mad to see Erykah on this list, but this is yet another case of right artist, wrong album. I personally would have gone with Mama's Gun, which I find to be a stronger and more cohesive artistic statement from her. I've always found Metallica a smidge overrated personally, but this definitely is their strongest front-to-back album, even though Apple Music could have also easily put the Black Album or Ride the Lightning here instead. I've also never been fully able to get into Nine Inch Nails, but the Downward Spiral definitely is their most iconic album for a reason, and it deserves to be somewhere on this list. The Tyler album on this list also easily could have been Igor, but I'm glad that it was Flower Boy, as that's my personal favorite Tyler project. It is still a gorgeous album from start to finish. Doggy Style definitely sounds like a time capsule of what rap music sounded like in the early 90s, but it's still an incredibly fun album to listen to and play at house parties and barbecues, even more than 3 decades later. There are definitely a few Neil Young albums Apple Music could have gone with here, but After the Gold Rush is definitely one of his most poignant artistic statements, and I'm glad this is the one they went with. I'm a little bit surprised Apple Music didn't go with Under Construction here, but Supa Dupa Fly is one hell of an entrance for Missy Elliott in the music world, and it's, in my opinion, still her finest body of work. I've always preferred the Beatles over the Rolling Stones for the most part, but Exile on Main Street is a great example of how to make a truly ambitious and sonically thrilling bluesy rock and roll album. Paul's Boutique is definitely the Beastie Boys' most sonically daring album and a very experimental left turn from License to Ill, but it's definitely the album that showcased the true scope of all 3 members' artistic potential. The Marshall Mathers LP is still Eminem's finest full-length project, even if its lyrical content, while incredibly shocking in its time, is straight up cancelable today. Though I'm still not sure it's quite best 100 albums of all time good, Solange's A Seat at the Table is still a wonderful, gorgeous listen. And yes, I realize how hot of a take it is to put this album ahead of both albums on this list by her sister. Inner Visions is one of Stevie Wonder's best known albums and one of his most political as well, and contains some of his best known songs like Living for the City and Higher Ground. It's definitely one I'm glad to see on here. Control is definitely a great introduction to Janet Jackson as an artist, but it's definitely not the album I would have picked here, especially as the next 3 albums she'd make were all much more daring and ambitious than this one. Personally, I'm partial to The Velvet Rope. Sign of the Times is basically Prince's equivalent to the Beastie Boys' Paul's Boutique. It's one of the most ambitious and experimental projects he ever made in his lifetime, and for that, I'm glad it's on here. It definitely feels a bit like recency bias to have Billie Eilish on a list like this, but When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go is about as good as one could have possibly hoped for a debut album from her. Having said that, calling it the 30th best album of all time like Apple Music did is a bit of a stretch. Casey Musgrave's Golden Hour is a fantastic country album without a doubt, but it is a little weird to see virtually no representation for country or country-adjacent genres other than that. Dr. Dre's The Chronic is without a doubt the seminal gangsta rap album, but I think his follow-up 2001 is even better. Massive Attack's Blue Lines is, again, another seminal early 90s album for a specific genre, in this case trip-hop, but I absolutely 100% would have gone with Mezzanine here. Born to Run is definitely one of Bruce Springsteen's most famous bodies of work, and its title track remains an all-time great rock and roll anthem, but I'm very, very surprised they didn't go with Born in the USA instead. The Blueprint is definitely one of Jay-Z's defining artistic statements, and unquestionably one of his best albums, but I've always preferred his debut, Reasonable Doubt, and I would have liked to see that one make the cut. I feel like it's a coin flip between this and Fear of a Black Planet, as they're both classic hip-hop albums, but I'm glad that Public Enemy is on the list to begin with. Kraftwerk are one of the pioneers of electronic music, and I am very, very happy Apple Music gave them their flowers here. There's not a whole lot for me to say about The Clash's London Calling, other than that it was the sound of one of an era's defining bands at the peak of their artistic powers. I love Gaucho as well, but as far as choosing which Steely Dan album to put on this list, you can definitely do a lot worse than Asia. Of anything Marvin Gaye made during his life, What's Going On is probably the album he's most remembered for, thanks in no small part to its title track. I don't know if it's quite 17th best album of all time good, but it absolutely deserves to be here. Within 12 tracks, Carole King's Tapestry contains some of the most memorable songs of the 70s, not the least of which being the theme song from Gilmore Girls. Her placement here is well earned. I absolutely love that Apple Music made room for Burial here. This was a truly innovative and groundbreaking release in electronic music and considered a pivotal album in the development of dubstep. It's just a shame that they only put it at 94. NWA, Straight Outta Compton, absolutely critical album for the development of gangsta rap. Not much else I can say here. Exodus is easily Bob Marley's best album. That second half especially, jamming, Waiting in Vain, Turn Your Lights Down Low, Three Little Birds, and One Love back to back. Chef's kiss. 3 Feet High and Rising is of course the album that introduced the world to De La Soul. It absolutely deserves to be here, and Apple Music could have just as easily snubbed De La Soul altogether, but I'm glad they didn't. The Joshua Tree is definitely, in my opinion, U2's strongest album, though you also could have gone with War, The Unforgettable Fire, or Achtung Baby here. Highway 61 Revisited is an excellent Bob Dylan album, don't get it twisted, but in my opinion, Blonde on Blonde absolutely clears it. Similarly, Abbey Road is a fantastic Beatles album, but A, it is not the third best album of all time, and B, Apple Music did Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band dirty. Patti Smith's Horses is an album that manages to be both legendary and underrated at the same time. It's an album that's been part of my life since high school and definitely deserves to be higher than 83rd. With all due respect to Electric Ladyland, Are You Experienced is the definitive Jimi Hendrix album. 10 out of 10, no notes. D'Angelo's Voodoo is an all-time great R&B album by one of the genre's most reclusive figures. I'm definitely glad it's on this list at all, even if it's at 57. Rage Against the Machine's self-titled debut is, in my opinion, the quintessential rap rock album. This band and album also went a long way in helping radicalize my politics and worldview. It's a thrilling album from start to finish. Shame on Apple Music for only putting it 97. Though I think a strong case could have been made for one of either Stankonia or ATLiens, my personal favorite Outkast album, to be on here instead. Aquemini is one of Andre and Big Boy's greatest works, and I'm glad they put this on here. What's the Story? Morning Glory is indeed a classic album, but I feel like Apple Music went with this one for Oasis because it's the one that has Wonderwall on it. I think a lot of Oasis fans, especially in the UK, would have advocated for Definitely Maybe to be here instead, especially as that record is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. However you may feel about Kanye, Lord knows I have my issues with him. My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy is still his magnum opus, and yes, that includes the School trilogy. I do think 8th is a little high for Back to Black, but Amy Winehouse was a generational singing talent, and this is her career-defining album. A truly mesmerizing album by one of the most mesmerizing artists to ever do it. I needn't say more. Songs in the Key of Life is probably Stevie Wonder's most easily recognizable album. It contains some of his most iconic songs, Sir Duke and Isn't She Lovely among them, and it's probably the album most people think of first when trying to decide which of his works is his best. Though I prefer the other Miles Davis album with a title I probably can't say here without getting demonetized, Kind of Blue is still an absolute Rolls Royce of a jazz album. Portishead's Dummy is possibly the all-time great trip-hop album. Musically and in terms of production, the whole thing just sounds so cinematic, and it's held up very well. There's a reason why Ready to Die is consistently seen as one of the greatest hip-hop albums of all time. It's an album that introduced the world to one of the future GOATs in such an emphatic way. It's a stone cold classic. John Coltrane's A Love Supreme is another one of the greatest jazz records to ever see the light of day. If you're open to that kind of music and haven't heard it yet, I strongly suggest you do. It's a thrilling listen. Apple Music definitely could have gone with several different Bowie records here, but I'm glad it's this one. It's definitely his most consistent and most fully realized, in my opinion. Joni Mitchell's Blue is one of the all-time great breakup albums. Probably also the musical high point of her career. We stan a Canadian queen. Nirvana's Nevermind definitely has a lot of the band's catchiest songs and does deserve to be in the conversation among the greatest albums of all time, but it is a bit of an overproduced album, and that is something that bugged Kurt Cobain a lot. For that reason, I feel like their follow-up album, In Utero, was given the cold shoulder here, as that album, produced by the late Steve Albini, sounds much more in keeping with the band's true spirit as far as production goes. As bummed as I am that there was no room for In Rainbows anywhere on this list, Radiohead's Kid A is still, in my opinion, the greatest expectation-subverting album of all time. I personally would have pounded the table hard for Midnight Marauders to be the choice here, but the Low End Theory is still one of A Tribe Called Quest's very finest albums, and still one of the greatest rap albums to ever be put to tape. This was the album that led the charge for the early 2000s garage rock revolution. It sounded incredibly fresh and exciting in 2001 and still sounds great today. It's a shame they only put it 68th. Yes, I know the cover art has aged poorly, and I honestly prefer her previous album Post over this one, but Homogenic is still the sound of Bjork at the absolute peak of her musical and artistic powers. Fifth is obviously too high for this album, but Frank Ocean's Blonde is still an incredibly important album to me and my life, and for that reason, I'm not too mad that it's ranked as high as it is. I still don't get Apple Music's argument for putting The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill at number 1. For me, it's one of the GOAT records, but not the GOAT. But it's still Lauryn Hill's defining artistic statement, at least outside of the Fugees, and it's not really a surprise that she hasn't released any other full-length albums since. As much as Morrissey is a giant walking L of a human being, The Queen is Dead is still the Smiths' magnum opus, and I would have been irate if it wasn't included. I don't know if it's even that hot of a take anymore to say that Good Kid, Mad City might just be the greatest West Coast rap album ever made. 36 Chambers introduced the world to one of the most exciting rap groups to ever do it, and one of the most unique too. They also absolutely nail the assignment on their first try. As far as Talking Heads albums go, Remain in Light is without a doubt their crowning achievement. If you've watched my channel before, you've probably noticed how much I love Talking Heads, but Remain in Light is truly the cream of the crop. I have loved this album ever since I was 9 years old. That was back when it came out, and it still holds up incredibly well as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, dance music album of all time. 10 songs, almost 40 minutes, no skips, almost no features, some of the best producers in rap history, some of the best songs in rap history. There's a reason Nas has never reached those heights since. One of the most gorgeously produced albums ever made, featuring some of the most gorgeously written songs ever made. That pretty much sums it up. I don't know what to say about Thriller that hasn't already been said thousands of times over, other than that it set a whole new standard for what a pop album could be. Disintegration is The Cure at their very best. It is a truly captivating listen from front to back, and by far my favorite Cure album. If only every album where its musicians were constantly at each other's throats and or literally breaking up with each other and writing songs aimed at each other sounded nearly this good. Purple Rain is the musical pinnacle of Prince's life and career, and you could make a very strong case for this to be the greatest movie soundtrack of all time. Too bad the actual movie is garbage. Radiohead's OK Computer came out right around the time when the internet was starting to truly become a cultural force, and despite that, it doesn't sound dated in the slightest. If anything, it ages more and more like a fine wine the deeper into the internet age we go. Revolver is my absolute favorite Beatles album. Across each of the songs, we hear all four members, yes, even Ringo, taking turns at lead vocals and reaching new career heights while doing it. Possibly the most influential album in rock music history, and yet Apple Music still ranked it behind Rihanna's Anti. Finally, whoever put Dark Side of the Moon all the way down at 28 should be fired. Yes, it's a cliche number one, but you know what? Some cliches exist for a reason. This album is a dazzling, marvelous, truly transformative listen. I'm sure in 1973 it must have sounded like it was sent directly from outer space, and even now it doesn't really sound like an artifact of its time. In fact, it still sounds otherworldly in terms of its production, its music, its lyricism, everything about it. For me, the answer to my personal choice for what should have been number one on this list could not be clearer. Dark Side all day, every day, baby. Thanks so much for watching. What do you think the #1 album on Apple Music's list should be? Which albums should be on their list that aren't? How would you have ordered their list differently? What did you think of my ranking? Please let me know all your thoughts down below in the comments, and remember to like, comment, share, and or subscribe if you haven't already. I've got another video coming out very soon too, so stay tuned for that. This has been Sound and Vision, and I'll hopefully see you then.